You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence and murder. Listener discretion is advised.
It's August 23, 2016, in a sleepy Queensland town named Home Hill, just south of Townsville. Shelley's Backpackers is a modest hostel in the small regional town where backpackers on working holiday visas stay while they're completing their mandatory farm work. The days are long and hot. They see snakes and operate heavy machinery without any training. Aren't those brown snakes meant to be deadly? They think to themselves. At night, they sleep in dormitories, some sharing rooms with strangers. On that evening of August 23, a few of the British backpackers go to the pub. They have a few beers and something to eat before heading back for an early night. Among them is a 21-year-old woman named Mia Ayliffe-Chung. Another is Chris Porter. When they return to the hostel, everyone climbs into their separate beds and drifts off to sleep. Mia, at this point, had only been working there a week. Already, though, she was anxious. Something had been troubling her. A few hours later, Chris awoke to screams unlike anything he'd ever heard. Something was terribly wrong. And shockwaves were sent from this tiny Queensland town all the way back to England. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Rosie Ayliffe, whose daughter, Mia Ayliffe-Chung, was completing farm work in Australia when she was fatally stabbed in a Queensland backpackers hostel. I wanted to begin with the night that you got a knock on the door in August 2016. What did the police say on that night?
They said there's no easy way of saying this. Your daughter has been mortally wounded.
And your daughter wasn't in the UK with you when that happened. She was overseas in Australia. Why had Mia been in Australia?
She was travelling. She'd gone on a sort of trip of a lifetime. She had saved up for it and received a bit of a windfall from an insurance payout. So she'd just gone over there to work and to experience life over there. And I think in the back of her mind, she wanted to settle in Australia if she could.
What do you think the attraction was for Mia to go to Australia?
Well, like many young people from this part of the world, they're attracted by the sun foremost, and then the big skies and the beautiful beaches and the amazing wildlife. And I mean, I didn't realise how wonderful Australia was till I went there myself. But when you compare your cities to ours, they're just so easy to live in and beautiful.
And Mia was obviously very interested in travel. What kind of person was she otherwise? How would you describe her?
Vivacious and very funny. She's just hilarious. And then she had a caring side where, you know, she was very aware of inequalities in the world, and she was kind and loved children. And she had a spiritual side as well. She was interested in Buddhism.
And did she know at this stage of her life what sort of career she wanted to pursue?
She was in two minds. I mean, she was a talented actress, actually, and enjoyed acting. And she also had done a bit of modelling and enjoyed that. But I think long term, she would have ended up working with children in some respect because she had an obsession with them from being very young. And she trained in childcare. So I think that would have been her long term goal. But she also wanted a big family.
And when she arrived in Australia, you said that maybe, you know, it was in her sights to settle down here. But what was originally her thoughts about how long she might stay?
Well, she was doing her 88 days to get a second year, but so she was thinking from 1 year to the next rather than anything more than that.
And in order to stay that extra year, as you say, she had to do the 88 days of farm work. And for a lot of Australians and, you know, a lot of international listeners, they might not know what that actually entails. What do you have to do in those 88 days in order to stay?
Well, there are certain postcodes and they're all remote from the cities, and you have to work in those postcodes for a minimum of 88 days, which generally turns out to be a lot longer than 88 days. And there are only certain types of work you can do. So anything to do with agriculture, mining is another one, and forestry, I think. So there's a limited number of types of work you can do.
What did Mia find to do?
Well, she turned down work at Caboolture, which was nearer to Brisbane, because I think she wanted to be with her friends. And I told her to stay with other people for safety. So she ended up travelling only with one lad in the end who made it there. And she was working on a sugarcane farm.
Did she speak to you at all in that week about what the work itself was like?
She talked about snakes and spiders. And I knew she was really terrified of spiders. But I was more worried about the snakes. And yeah, she said that she was under pressure competing for work with the other people in the hostel, and some of them had been sat around doing nothing. And then she was given work when she first arrived, which she found quite odd because, I mean, she wasn't exactly built for farm work. She was 5'3" and, you know, very slight. So, we were both a bit confused that she was prioritised over others. And yeah, she said it was hard and she'd been picking up stones. So that was in another field where she picked up stones and thrown them into the truck. And she got to drive the truck, which she was quite excited about. But then she talks about she was counting the number of snakes and spiders she was seeing. And I asked her whether she'd had any induction in what to do, because a friend of mine said, oh, she will see snakes in the fields of North Queensland. And I said, well, do you know what to do? And she said, no, what do you mean? And I thought, that's when alarm bells started to ring for me that she hadn't even been told what to do if she saw a snake.
So she hasn't had any sort of induction. Was there a sense that there was anyone in charge of looking after her, of training her, of being the person she might go to if she was uncomfortable or scared?
No, this is the thing, she hadn't had any training or induction. And the person who was in control of that situation, if you like, had been aggressive towards her. I mean, the woman who ran the hostel had screamed at her, was how Mia put it, for having a bottle of beer, which she put on a shelf in her room. Mia doesn't drink beer, so she was saving it to give to somebody. She'd been given it as a present when she finished her first shift to say thank you. She put the bottle on the shelf, and this woman came in and saw the bottle and absolutely lost it at Mia, to the extent that Mia was audibly upset when I spoke to her. I mean, she threatened to throw Mia out if she ever had alcohol. I thought, there must be a no alcohol policy. But no, they had a bar. They ran their own bar in the hostel. And they sold beer to the backpackers, presumably at inflated prices. So she wasn't allowed beer from outside, only from their bar. So there was a lot more going on, as I found out later. But at the time, I just thought, this is not what I was expecting. This is supposed to be a government-run scheme.
You travelled to Queensland to retrieve Mia's body. And while you weren't let into the actual hostel where she was killed, you did hear from others who had been staying there. What did those people tell you?
I was told about a febrile atmosphere in the hostel, a sense of unease and antagonism that was fostered between the young people because they were in this competition for jobs. And I did hear when I went back, I met some backpackers and they said, we had some work and then we thought we'd been sacked. And somebody came along and she was younger and prettier than us. She was given work straight away. And then I heard other stories, about what was going on in that area, that there was a sort of sex for sign-off thing going on in the Burdekin. In fact, I reported it to the police and they said, yeah, it's rape, because the young people are being abused because they are told that they won't, even after they've done the work, that they won't get their papers signed off unless they perform sexual acts. And that's meant to be happening in the Burdekin. And as far as I know, that's still happening.
So there's clearly widespread exploitation of backpackers. What's the pay situation for those 88 days? What kind of reimbursement are they getting for that hard labour on the land?
Well, it really depends. There are obviously some very fair farmers out there who are paying good wages and that are paying your award rates. And then there's other places where they're getting piece rates. And these can be fine and you can earn a living if you work hard enough. But then there are piece rates where you cannot earn enough, however hard you work. But then sometimes it's not so much how much is being paid, it's how many hours are offered. And the hours can be eked out because the hostel workers and the farmers are working together. The hours are eked out to keep the young people there for as long as possible. So the 88 days becomes 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, into 8 months sometimes, where they're just being kept on 2 days a week. And they're saying, there's not enough work for you all, so we're giving you all a little bit here.
That level of vulnerability to people who are already vulnerable because they're not in their own country, and then add to that the exploitation of, not being paid properly or not being given the hours they were promised. How did you feel about your daughter? She's in this hostel and she's sharing a room with two people she didn't know, and both of them were men. Did that make her nervous or did that make you nervous?
I didn't know that until she was dead. One conversation I had with her was about the snakes and about not having had any induction. And I said to her, you need to start keeping a diary. Another conversation I had with her was where she said, I've met a strange woman and she's going to help me. She's helped other backpackers. And my understanding was, whether she actually said it or not, my understanding was that she thought this woman was going to take her from the hostel onto her farm and let her stay on the farm. I know who she's talking about. It was Lorraine Garizio, and I've met her now. And she told me that Mia had been terrified.
Was she terrified of the one man in particular? Was it the situation, or was it the one person making her very uncomfortable?
The other guy was her friend. He came from Brisbane with her. He was absolutely fine. But he met somebody, and he wasn't actually in that room. So the idea was that she was in a room with Chris Porter, who was her friend. Chris Porter met a girl and was, elsewhere at night. So Mia was then left with someone who'd asked to be put into her room, but was saying to other people when he saw Mia, she was his wife, she belonged to him, she had been put in that room for him. That was his belief. Now, if you think about what we know about what was happening in the Burdekin, and about young girls being traded for sex, you can see where he might have got that idea from. I mean, it might be a stretch, but he thought Mia had been put in the room for him.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Rosie Ayliffe, whose daughter Mia was fatally stabbed in a Queensland backpackers hostel in 2016. What do you now know about what happened on that night when she lost her life?
Well, I do know that Mia was going to bed early because she told me she was desperate to get her 88 days and she only had 3 months to do it in, so she wasn't ever going to do it. But she was desperate to keep working really hard to get her days. So she was turning in early, and all I know is that he appeared at the door with her at knife point and she was fighting. She was fighting for her life. And he just stabbed and stabbed and stabbed her and she ran away. She ran to the toilet and died. And then Tom came to the door and started battering on the door to get at Ayad. And he got in and then Ayad killed Tom too.
What do you now know about Ayad, who did this?
Not very much, apart from that he was from a good family, as far as everybody reports back, he was a good man and, a gentle person, and nobody really had a bad word to say about him. I mean, he lost his temper and threatened somebody before Mia arrived, but there were no obvious signs until she arrived. And then, people do say he started acting strangely when she arrived. But he did smoke a lot of ganja. So if he had a predisposition to schizophrenia or, other mental illness, then that can help to trigger it, I think.
And after this story became international news and it spread from Australia to the UK, you began to receive messages from people about their experiences during these 88 days of farm work. What did people begin to tell you?
Accommodation problems, people being called for work where there wasn't any, and then staying in expensive hostels waiting for work and then getting 2 days at a time. That's a widespread practice. And then stories about sexual assaults, particularly on women, but not always, rapes, and sort of systemic sexual grooming in the case of one particular charming gentleman who I think his name is out in the press now, but just in case it isn't, I won't say it. And others where girls are just really scared, and they're obviously being deliberately frightened. And then pay can be a big issue where they're working on piece rates and never going to earn enough for their keep. So they get into debt to the hostel.
From what you've heard, does it sound as though women are at more risk than men in these situations?
I think there's that added risk of sexual exploitation, which is less prevalent with the men. But then the men can get more sort of verbal bullying. I mean, it was a grown man who was very strong cyclist. He cycled across Europe, arrived in Australia and went out into the field. No water provided, which again is industry standard, and we're not allowed in the UK to not provide water in the fields. It's illegal. No toileting facilities either. But anyway, This lad was his first day, got dehydrated, and they said just carry on through, just keep working. And they were short of time to get the harvest in. And he died that day in front of his best friend, who's now completely traumatised by the whole thing.
That's so beyond disgraceful, because that's one of the biggest dangers, would be on those fields under that sun for that amount of time to anyone.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what can be done? This is something that the government mandates, yet there doesn't appear to be, there is no regulation. What needs to be done in Australia to ensure that this isn't happening?
I think the issues are so complex that what you need now is a Royal Commission, because, you've had them into things like aged care and
child sex abuse, yep.
Yeah. So compared to this, they're relatively straightforward. But, you now know, because of COVID, how important these young people are for the agricultural industry, because your crops have been rotting in your fields over the last few months. You also know, because there have been several reports published, including one by Fair Work, on the levels of non-compliance and abuse in this industry. And you must understand the reputational damage that does to your country. So surely it's time to collate all this and to come up with an action plan. Because at the moment, it seems that nothing is working. Nothing is working, because it doesn't matter what laws you pass. Nobody's using the laws. There's no convictions under these laws. And for someone to die in your fields, for a family to lose a family member, and then to find out that the farmer's been fined $20,000 because of the death of their child, it's just an insult to injury. It's just beyond belief, really.
And it does, as you say, keep happening. It's in the headlines almost like clockwork, that someone will lose their life, and this is a young person with their whole life ahead of them, and it's due to violence or it's due to conditions that are so horribly avoidable.
If it was Australian young people who were losing their lives, how would you feel? How would you feel as a country? What would you be doing?
There would be people marching on the streets. There would be such outcry. If this was happening to Australian people in another country, then it would be something that we simply wouldn't accept. And the things we would believe about that country and how they treat people would be horrifying. And yet people come here as guests to our country, which so many people are so proud of, and die. Like, that's just not something that should ever, ever happen in Australia, which claims to be wealthy and safe and hospitable.
Exactly.
Do you think that Mia's life could have been saved, that it could have been avoided if there was some regulation, if they hadn't put her in a room with a stranger? Do you look back on that and think her life could have been saved?
I try not to go down that route because I'm not really campaigning against one hostel or one set of people. And I don't know. There's so many ifs. If I hadn't let her go to Australia, would I have managed to keep her away? If I'd brought her up differently, it's easy to point the finger and it's easy to blame, but the person who really is to blame is the man who killed her, But having said that, I would like to know that there were now laws and regulations in place that would stop it from happening again. And I'm not convinced that's the case. I'm not convinced that these hostels are now super safe because my daughter died. That's all I'm asking, is for people to move on and to learn from what happened.
Rosie Ayliffe has been campaigning for 5 years to change Australia's farm work system, which she believes contributed to her daughter's death in 2016. Her book, Far From Home, is the story of her fight to protect other families from suffering a similar tragic fate. You can find a link to her book in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join. If you're looking for more Mamma Mia podcasts, then listen to The Quickie as they investigate why Aboriginal deaths in custody are still so prevalent 30 years on from the Royal Commission.
What do you say to people who say the justice system isn't racist? White people are being thrown in jail too. White people and people of other ethnic backgrounds, they die in custody too. How do you explain to those people how the system works against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders?
Well, what's the population of this country? 20 million? And Aboriginal people make up not even 1 million of that population. But yet Aboriginal people are the most incarcerated people on this earth. Our people's statistics are always outrageously high, yet we are only a very, very small percentage of people that make up the total population of this country. And I hear that a lot, that white people die in prison as well, and it's terrible. No one should die in prison. I'm not saying that I don't care about those who are not Aboriginal who are also dying in custody. It is the proportionality of how many Aboriginal people are dying in custody in terms of statistics and population that is an outright human rights abuse, that people need to just educate themselves a bit more and see that it is a real problem and that there's not many of us, and the ones that are left are dying at a faster rate than anybody else.
You'll find a link to that episode in our show notes.